Have you ever looked at an old wedding photograph and felt like the person in it was hiding a secret? Not a secret of love, but of struggle, silent, fierce, and buried for more than a century. The photograph, taken in San Francisco in the early 20th century, captures the moment a young Italian bride, Elena Machetti, bowed in the wedding ceremony. But beneath the white veil and that seemingly docile gaze was something else, a will. A silent vow that even the bride knew would change her community forever. From an arranged marriage, Elena gradually entered a confrontation with ancient traditions, with the laws of her family, and with prejudices about women in a changing immigrant world. Tonight, we'll retrace that photograph steps to learn how one single woman defied the system and changed history without anyone noticing. It was October 2024. In the quiet reading room of the California Historical Society, under the pale hum of archival lamps, genealogist Dr. Amanda Foster made a discovery she could not have anticipated. What began as a routine project tracing the lineage of a San Francisco merchant family would lead her toward one of the city's most carefully concealed family secrets. She had been reviewing earthquake recovery records, old business ledgers, and marriage registries from the early 1900s when something unusual caught her eye. Tucked among yellowed documents was a wedding photograph, beautifully preserved, strangely luminous, and signed in embossed lettering, Benedetti and Sons, Photography, San Francisco. At first glance, it appeared ordinary. A formal wedding portrait, dated 1906, showing about 15 people, arranged in the stately composition so common at the time. The bride, no older than her early 20s, wore an exquisite white silk gown, threaded with lace and pearls, her dark hair styled in the elegant Gibson fashion. Beside her stood the groom, a man at least twice her age, distinguished, confident, dressed in black, with a gleaming white boutonniere. Around them, generations of family members posed in layers of pride and propriety. The elderly sat upon carved wooden chairs. The younger ones stood close behind, all framed by rich floral arrangements and velvet drapery. Every detail, from the polished shoes to the beads on the gown, seemed to whisper of status and tradition, the image of success that so many immigrant families of the era wished to project. But as Dr. Foster studied the photograph, a subtle unease began to form. The picture was too perfect. There was no fading, no yellowing, not even the soft chemical stains that marked the passage of time. It had survived the 1906 earthquake, the fires that followed, and over a century of change, untouched, almost defiant against decay. Someone had kept it safe, wrapped in a leather portfolio, guarded as if it held something more than memory. The photograph belonged to the Rossini family, once prominent Italian-American merchants who helped rebuild their corner of San Francisco after the quake. Their descendants had donated the image to the Historical Society, unaware of what it truly represented, believing it merely an heirloom from a proud beginning. But Dr. Foster saw something else, something that refused to fit neatly into the story of immigrant success. In her laboratory at UC Berkeley, she placed the photograph under a digital scanner designed for forensic preservation. The image measured 10 by 14 inches, remarkably intact, its clarity, astonishing even for the city's finest portrait studio. The lighting was perfect, the expressions meticulously composed, and yet there was something in those expressions, something in the way the bride's eyes didn't quite meet the camera. something in the space between the couple, the stiffness of hands that should have been clasped in celebration. What Dr. Foster had not yet realized was that this photograph, so elegant, so lovingly preserved, was not a keepsake of love, but of control. A symbol of forced unions of silence, and of the quiet power structures that ruled the lives of women in immigrant households long after the city had rebuilt itself. But how could such darkness hide in plain sight inside an image meant to capture joy? And who all those years ago wanted so badly for it to be remembered just like this? The photograph's depth of field was flawless. Each face, from the proud patriarch to the youngest child, remained in perfect, unwavering focus. A technical achievement that spoke of mastery. Whoever stood behind that camera had known exactly what they were doing and who they were serving. As Dr. Foster positioned the portrait beneath her high-resolution scanner, the machine's hum filled the quiet of her Berkeley lab. Line by line, the image reappeared on her monitor, a ghost resurrected from 1906. She took note of the precision, the balance of the composition, the natural grace of the poses. Despite their formality, the richness of the background. Every detail whispered of expense of a family determined to present itself as fully respectably American. When the scan reached full clarity, it was like stepping into the room itself. She could see the embroidery on the women's sleeves, the coarse texture of the men's wool suits, even the faint grain of the wooden furniture beneath the velvet drapery. The subtle gradations of light and shadow gave the portrait an almost three-dimensional presence, as if the people within might shift slightly if one looked too long. At 200% magnification, Dr. Foster searched for traces of retouching, a common practice in professional portraiture of that era. But there was none. No brush marks, no softening of wrinkles, no artificial glow. The image was untouched, honest in a way that made its perfection almost unnerving. At 400%, she began studying each individual face. The elder generation, the patriarchs and matriarchs, carried the dignified gravity of those who had crossed oceans and built fortunes from nothing. Their children standing behind them exuded the confidence of assimilation, first-generation Americans caught between tradition and progress. But when she reached 600% magnification, her cursor resting over the bride, something felt off. The smile was there, small, proper, restrained, yet something in the eyes contradicted it. They were too steady, too knowing. At 800, the illusion broke entirely. Dr. Foster leaned closer. The bride's expression, so demure from afar, revealed a startling intensity when magnified. Her eyes seemed to burn through the photograph itself, not with joy, but with resolve. There was sorrow in that gaze, and something else. Something that refused to be forgotten. Who was this young woman really? And what truth had been sealed within this flawless portrait? For more than a century, Dr. Foster began her investigation with the city's surviving archives. San Francisco's post-earthquake recovery records and the carefully preserved documentation of immigrant communities. Most of the city's official records from 1906 had been lost in fire and rubble. Yet immigrant families, especially within the Italian-American enclaves, had kept their own ledgers, letters, and baptismal records. She soon traced the family in the photograph, the Rossinis. The patriarch Giuseppe Rossini had arrived in San Francisco in 1885 with his wife Maria and their two sons. He built a modest import business in North Beach, dealing in Italian foodstuffs and wines. The taste of home for a growing community far from Sicily. By 1906, Rossini's enterprise had flourished into 3 stores and a warehouse by the waterfront. Then came the earthquake. The ground split. The city burned. 2 of his stores collapsed and the warehouse was lost entirely. Yet, within 6 months, Giuseppe had secured substantial loans and reopened stronger, richer, ready to take advantage of the city's feverish reconstruction. But while his business rose from the ashes, something darker was happening within the family's private affairs. In the course of her research, Dr. Foster discovered that the bride in the photograph had not been a Rossini by birth at all. Her name was Elena Machetti, a young woman from Sicily who had arrived in San Francisco late in 1905, just months before the quake. She had traveled alone, barely 18, sponsored by distant relatives who had promised her employment as a domestic servant. Immigration manifests confirmed her arrival, listing a single trunk and a note of sponsorship from the Benedetti family, the very same family that owned the photography studio where the wedding portrait had been taken. Coincidence or connection? Further investigation led Dr. Foster to the San Francisco City Hall marriage records, where one date stood out: November 15th, 1906. On that day, Elena Machetti, 18 years old, newly arrived alone in a foreign city, had married Antonio Rossini, the eldest son of Giuseppe. He was 41, 23 years her senior, and somewhere deep in that photograph, her eyes had been telling the truth all along. The marriage license, signed in neat ink and witnessed by Giuseppe Rossini and Salvatore Benedetti, confirmed what Dr. Foster had begun to suspect, that the 2 families had formally arranged the union long before the ceremony ever took place. In the Italian-language newspapers of early 20th century San Francisco, the wedding had been celebrated as a triumph of social progress, a proud alliance between 2 successful immigrant houses. Columns described the event in glowing terms: the finery, the guests, the symbolism of prosperity, reborn after the great earthquake. And yet, not a single word mentioned affection. No courtship, no romantic tale. Only business. When Dr. Foster cross-referenced the wedding date with the Rossini family's business records, the pattern became clearer. Tucked between receipts and shipping manifests were handwritten notes: wages paid E. Machetti Domestic Services, January through October 1906. Elena had not entered the Rossini home as a bride at all, she had come as a servant. And her employment had lasted exactly 10 months, until the day she became Antonio Rossini's wife. The photograph, she realized, was not a keepsake of love. It was a contract immortalized on film. Her investigation soon revealed that Elena's marriage had not been an isolated case, but part of a broader practice within the city's Italian-American community. Historians had a name for it: arranged placement marriages. Young women from southern Italy and Sicily were brought across the ocean, their journeys sponsored by wealthier immigrant families, not for work, but for alliance. They were placed into households to be observed, trained, and if found suitable, married into those very families. At the Italian-American Museum of San Francisco, Dr. Foster consulted with Dr. Carlo Benedetti, a scholar of early immigrant social structures. He explained quietly that after the 1906 earthquake, when fortunes had been shattered and rebuilt overnight, families sought security through marriage rather than love. Each union was a link in a growing chain of influence businesses, joined by blood trust, sealed with dowries rather than vows. The women who arrived were promised opportunity, safety, even admiration. But many found themselves bound instead by the quiet laws of commerce and tradition contracts written in expectation, not affection. Through meticulous research, Dr. Foster traced Elena's path back to her origins in Palermo, Sicily. Immigration documents revealed that she had been selected through the Benedetti family's connections. In the Benedetti archives, brittle pages sealed in envelopes that had not been opened in a century, she found the proof. One letter dated August 1905 carried the spidery handwriting of Salvatore Benedetti to a cousin in Palermo. Giuseppe Rossini requires a suitable wife for his son Antonio. The young woman should be between 18 and 20 years of age, of good reputation, and willing to adapt to American customs. Financial arrangements have been settled, including passage and appropriate dowry considerations. A reply came a month later. Elena Marchetti has been chosen for the Rossini placement. She is 19, orphaned, well-regarded, and eager for opportunity in America. She understands the nature of the arrangement and has agreed to the terms. It was all there: the signatures, the stamps, the polite efficiency of a trade conducted between families. Elena had been promised not a job, but a future one, already planned for her before she ever set foot on the ship that carried her to California. Her year as a domestic servant, it seemed, had been little more than a trial period, a test to see whether she could conform to the expectations of her hosts, or rather, her future in-laws. And yet, the correspondence didn't end there. In the Rossini family, letters preserved by Maria Rossini, Giuseppe's wife, Dr. Foster, found words that suggested something more complex. Maria had written home to relatives in Italy, and her tone was cautious, even uneasy. Elena has adapted well to American customs, she wrote in July of 1906, but she maintains an independence of spirit that sometimes concerns us. She reads often. She asks questions about business affairs that are not the concern of women. She expresses opinions on politics and society that make her less compliant than we had hoped. It was a small admission, but one that said so much. Even within the boundaries of an arranged marriage, Elena had dared to think, to question, to see the world beyond her assigned role. And when Dr. Foster re-examined that wedding photograph magnified once more upon her screen, she began to wonder, was that the look of defiance flickering in the young bride's eyes, or was it the faint, unspoken knowledge that the story being told about her life had never truly belonged to her at all? The descriptions Dr. Foster uncovered of Elena's intellect, her restlessness, her unwillingness to yield aligned perfectly with the look she had seen in that photograph. The piercing gaze, the stillness that wasn't submission but restraint. This was not the expression of a timid pride, but of a woman acutely aware of her circumstances and quietly determined to bend them to her will. Through deeper research, Dr. Foster began to realize that Elena's story was not an isolated one. Her marriage to Antonio Rossini had been only a single strand in a larger web of alliances, a deliberate network of marriages linking San Francisco's wealthiest Italian-American families after the earthquake of 1906. The reconstruction had created new fortunes for those who could rebuild quickly and strategically. Families like the Rossinis and the Benedettis pooled resources, merging capital and connections in ways that blurred the lines between blood and business. Partnership agreements from the period revealed joint ventures that reached far beyond Giuseppe Rossini's modest import firm. The Benedettis had invested heavily in the Rossini supply trade, while Giuseppe himself had financed the expansion of the Benedetti family's photography and printing operations. Marriage, it seemed, was simply the most permanent form of contract. Dr. Foster traced at least 4 such unions between the two families and their associates during those years. In 1907, Salvatore Benedetti's daughter wed one of Giuseppe Rossini's nephews. Soon after, Antonio's sister married a young man brought from Sicily specifically to join the Benedetti printing business. Each marriage carried with it substantial financial agreements, properties exchanged, debts forgiven, capital shared. The results were striking. By 1910, the Rossini-Benedetti partnership controlled a large share of San Francisco's Italian import trade, the city's most influential Italian-language press, and a growing portfolio of real estate across the newly reconstructed downtown. To outsiders, it looked like the perfect immigrant success story. Families rising from disaster into prosperity, united by enterprise and tradition. But behind those polished facades, the success depended on the compliance of the women who had been brought across the ocean to secure these alliances. And one of them, Elena, had refused to play her part quietly. Letters exchanged between the families in early 1907 revealed that she had begun to question the boundaries set for her. In one dated February 1907, Giuseppe Rossini wrote to Salvatore Benedetti in a tone that balanced irritation with disbelief. Elena continues to present challenges we had not anticipated. She requests access to business ledgers, asks about our financial arrangements, and proposes changes to the household beyond her proper role. Antonio finds her difficult to manage, despite his efforts to establish the necessary authority. Benedetti's reply, written weeks later, was more restrained, but no less telling. We chose Elena for her intelligence, believing it would ease her adaptation to American life. Perhaps we misjudged the strength of her will. She seems intent on extending her influence beyond what is appropriate within the family. The words were polite, but between the lines, Dr. Foster could feel the tension, the quiet alarm of men who had imported obedience but received ambition instead. As she continued to piece together the fragments, family correspondence ledgers, invoices, a clearer picture emerged. Elena had not merely resisted her assigned role, she had begun to alter the machinery of the family's business empire itself. Financial records from early 1907 showed her handwriting beside Antonio's, her name appearing on invoices, supplier letters, and freight orders. Within months of the wedding, she was handling correspondence directly with import partners and negotiating prices on her own. Her English, which she had barely known upon arrival, had become fluent and confident. And then, in a discovery that made Dr. Foster pause for a long time, in her dimly lit office came the trunk. It had been found decades later during a renovation of the old Rossini home in North Beach. Inside were Elena's papers, her notes, receipts, and something resembling a personal business diary. The handwriting was careful but firm, and the contents far beyond what anyone expected of a housewife in 1907. Detailed analyses of supplier reliability, comparisons of market prices, drafts of expansion plans for the import company, plans that suggested a sophisticated understanding of commerce and negotiation. She had been learning calculating, adapting. Among the pages, one diary entry stood out, dated May 15th, 1907, written in ink that had faded but not lost its strength. Giuseppe and Antonio treat me as though I am a child who cannot understand their affairs. Yet, in 6 months, I have learned more of their trade than Antonio has learned in 20 years beside his father. They imported me to strengthen their family, but they refused to see that my mind could strengthen their business as well. Her words were steady, without bitterness, more observation than complaint. But there was defiance there, quiet and unyielding. Dr. Foster could almost imagine her, a young woman in a heavy dress, seated by a window that looked out toward the recovering city, ink-stained fingers moving across a notebook by candlelight. Outside, San Francisco was rebuilding, and inside that house, so too, was Elena rebuilding herself piece by piece into something neither family had planned for. Yet, as her diary went on, her tone began to shift. Her entries grew more pointed, more careful. It was as if she had begun to sense that her independence, however rational, however deserved, was being noticed. And in that notice, there was danger. The tension within the Rossini household had been growing like a quiet storm. Elena's diary spoke of it first. Soft words inked in September of 1907, when she stumbled upon discrepancies buried deep within the family's import ledgers. She had traced them with trembling fingers, shipments undervalued for customs, yet sold to customers at inflated prices. It wasn't shrewd business, as her father-in-law liked to call it. It was deception, deliberate, dangerous, and dressed in respectability. When Elena had tried to confront her husband Antonio, he brushed her off gently, but firmly, reminding her that business was a man's world and her concerns belonged to the home. But Elena had not come to America to live behind closed doors. In secret, she began keeping her own records, neat columns of truth hidden away in a small ledger beneath the floorboards of her room. Perhaps she meant to protect herself. Perhaps she meant to change something. Dr. Foster, reading those notes a century later, could almost sense the quiet determination of the woman in that wedding photograph, the same sharp gaze that refused to soften. By 1908, that determination had turned into open conflict. Letters between Giuseppe Rossini and Salvatore Benedetti hinted at the family's growing desperation. They spoke of Elena as if she were a problem to be solved, even proposing the unthinkable to dissolve the marriage entirely and send her back to Sicily. It would have been easier, they believed, than letting her defiance spread. But Elena's voice was already echoing through San Francisco's Italian-American quarter. Other young wives had begun to whisper her name, to wonder why they too were not allowed to ask questions about the businesses they helped sustain. In one letter, Maria Benedetti confided to her sister in Los Angeles, "Elena Rossini has become a disruption among the younger wives. She urges them to question their husbands' arrangements, to ask for accounts, to speak of fairness. It cannot continue." Even the Italian-American Women's Auxiliary, a group meant to preserve tradition, tried to intervene. Meeting notes from March 1908 described how Mrs. Antonio Rossini was called before them, expected to repent. But instead, she spoke calmly of American customs, of legal rights, of the simple notion that a wife might share in the decisions of her own household. Some of the women, the record said, left that meeting uncertain for the first time. It was then that Elena became not just a wife or a dissenter, but a quiet threat. Her knowledge of English, her understanding of California law, had outgrown the boundaries her community tried to impose. One letter, written by Don Carlo Benedetti, a respected elder, warned Giuseppe Rossini in grave tones. Her behavior is drawing attention from reformers, from lawyers, from the press. If she continues to challenge our ways, she may bring scrutiny upon all of us. Our prosperity depends upon silence and discipline, not on women who believe they are free. And yet, Eleanor could not be silent. Even the church offered her no refuge. At St. Peter and Paul's Father, Martinelli listened patiently, but counseled obedience, advising her to submit to her husband's will and find peace in humility. Her reply, sent in a fading letter to her cousin in Sicily, spoke of something else entirely, a loneliness that grew not from distance, but from seeing too clearly the world around her and realizing that no one wished to see it with her. In her final letters, Eleanor's voice had grown sharper, weary, but unbroken. The entire community has united against me, she wrote to her cousin in Sicily, because I refuse to pretend that I am stupid and helpless. They imported me for my mind to strengthen their name, but now they wish to bury that mind beneath obedience. I will not surrender what makes me myself simply to please those who benefit from my intelligence, while denying it exists. By the end of 1908, her defiance had turned into a storm that no one could contain. What had begun as quiet tension now threatened to unravel an entire web of marriages, businesses, and unspoken agreements that held San Francisco's Italian-American community together. Dr. Foster's research showed how Eleanor's resolve deepened in those months, every diary entry like a heartbeat, measured and deliberate. On October 15, 1908, she wrote, "For 3 years I have proven my worth, and still they treat me as decoration. If they will not see my value willingly, then I will make it impossible for them to ignore." And then came the discovery, the one that changed everything. Hidden within shipping manifests and customs invoices, Eleanor found evidence of something darker. Her father-in-law, Giuseppe Rossini, had begun negotiating with criminal networks, arranging to use their import business to smuggle both goods and people under the cover of post-earthquake chaos. Eleanor refused to be complicit. She documented everything, coded notes, receipts, letters, assembling what she called a ledger of truth. In November 1908, she confronted Giuseppe directly. Her diary captured the moment with icy clarity. "I told him I wouldn't see this family's name destroyed by greed. He can either acknowledge my right to share in these decisions or face the consequences of his dealings exposed before the law." That single act, a woman defying the patriarch of her family, sent shockwaves through the community. Giuseppe's retaliation came swiftly and cruelly. He sought to have Elena declared insane, claiming that her refusal to submit to her husband's authority proved female instability. It was a tactic often used against women who thought too clearly or spoke too loudly, but Elena was ready. She had studied California's legal codes, memorizing the rights that even immigrant wives could claim. Court records later confirmed that she filed her own petitions blocking any attempt to commit her without proof of mental illness. And she went further still. She filed for legal separation from Antonio, declaring that their arranged marriage had been built upon fraud, that she had been brought to America under false pretenses. Those filings, Dr. Foster noted, were extraordinary among the earliest known cases of an immigrant woman using American law to challenge the arranged marriage system itself. Eleanor was not only fighting for herself, she was quietly threatening to expose an entire structure of hidden transactions and silent obedience. The backlash was immediate. The community that had once welcomed her now turned its face away. Women who had once admired her kept their distance. Merchants refused service. Her name was spoken in whispers. La Rebelle, the rebel. The fragile alliance of families that had bound together through marriages began to fracture under the weight of her defiance. And yet, amid the isolation, new voices began to echo hers. American reformers, journalists, and suffragists had started to hear her story. The foreign bride who used the law to confront her husband's world. In time, Elena's defiance would ripple outward, reshaping how immigrant families approached marriage, inheritance, and the place of women in their own households. But in 1908, it was simply one woman alone in San Francisco, standing against a system older than she was. And perhaps that's why Dr. Foster lingered on her story, because in that single photograph, Elena's eyes still seemed to hold the same quiet conviction that once unsettled an entire community. The storm Elena had unleashed could no longer be contained. Her legal challenges, first dismissed as the desperate acts of a disobedient wife, had drawn the full attention of American authorities who had long ignored what happened behind the closed doors of immigrant households. Dr. Foster found the records buried deep within the San Francisco courthouse archives. Court transcripts, depositions, and immigration files, bearing Elena's signature precise, deliberate, steady. Her petitions had not only sought separation from Antonio, they had triggered something far larger. Federal officials began to look closer at the practice of arranged marriage within immigrant communities. The question, whispered first in curiosity and then in alarm, was simple. Were these women truly brides? Or were they being trafficked under the guise of tradition? Elena's testimony gave those suspicions weight. She spoke in careful detail about how she had been recruited, how families negotiated payments, and how young women were brought across the ocean with promises that dissolved the moment they stepped onto American soil. Her courage forced open doors that had been closed for generations. Giuseppe Rossini's once thriving import business soon found itself under investigation as well. Customs officials examined ledgers and shipping manifests, tracing Elena's accusations of false declarations and duty evasion. Though no criminal charges were filed, the damage was done. Reputations crumbled, partnerships dissolved, and the old trust between the Italian-American merchant families began to fracture. And quietly, something remarkable began to happen. In the years that followed, marriage records within San Francisco's Italian community showed a steady decline in arranged unions. The practice that had once ensured power and profit now carried a shadow, the memory of one young woman who refused to play her assigned part. But Elena's victory came with a cost. She was shunned by the very community that had brought her across the sea. The invitations stopped. The greetings faded. Families crossed the street rather than meet her eyes. Her marriage to Antonio, already hollowed by conflict, became a quiet fiction. The census of 1910 recording them as married, yet living in separate quarters within the same family compound. The illusion of unity remained, but the bond had long since withered. Her diary from that year reads with quiet sorrow, "I have won the right to think, to speak, to act as an intelligent woman. But in doing so, I have lost the warmth of companionship and the home I hope to find in this new world." Still, she did not retreat. By 1910, Elena was managing portions of the Rossini import business herself, discreetly at first, then openly. Her strategies brought profits the men could not ignore. Even Giuseppe, who had once tried to silence her, was eventually forced to admit, though never allowed, that her insight had saved the family from ruin. Dr. Foster came to understand that the wedding portrait of Elena and Antonio was not simply an artifact of a bygone custom. It was a frozen moment in history, the instant when a young woman, seemingly compliant, was already plotting her quiet revolution. The sharpness of her gaze in that photograph, magnified beneath Foster's scanner, revealed not submission but strategy, not the soft warmth of a bride, but the concentrated resolve of someone who had seen her limits and was preparing to break them. Through Elena, an entire generation of Italian-American families was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth that their traditions could not survive unchanged beneath the eyes of a nation built upon law, equality, and individual will. Gradually, the most rigid customs softened. Daughters were given voices in family affairs. Marriages were chosen rather than arranged. And though she was never celebrated in her own time, Elena's resistance quietly reshaped her community's future. In the decades that followed, she became what few could have imagined, a woman of independent means, managing trade routes, financing new ventures, and mentoring young women who sought work rather than marriage. By the 1920s, newspapers occasionally mentioned her name, Madame Elena Rossini, a respected businesswoman whose fortune had survived both scandal and exile. Dr. Foster noted in her research that Elena's story had become something of a quiet legend, a parable of defiance whispered through generations of Italian-American daughters who refused to be silent. The Benedetti and Sons photograph, once meant to display respectability, had preserved something far more powerful, the face of rebellion at the moment it was still learning to disguise itself. Even now, more than a century later, under the soft glow of magnification, Elena's eyes seemed to follow the viewer, calm, unflinching, alive. They remind us that sometimes the greatest revolutions begin in silence, and that even a single portrait can carry the weight of an entire world learning to change.